If you can drive a Camry, you can drive a Ferrari. In this video, we are going to answer a huge question that a lot of people, and I especially did have at the start of my aviation career. What is it like to transition from piston engines to turbine engines?
That's like autopilot, dude.
How do you fly a helicopter? Well, I'm going to show you.
Now, just some background context, I did all of my flight training in a Robinson R22 and a Robinson R44. I also gave a bunch of flight instruction in a Cabri G2. I did most of my flying prior to turbine engines in small, light training helicopters. If you're in the same position I was, where you had done all of the piston stuff in small helicopters and you were looking at turbine helicopters, that's where you wanted to go next. I know exactly where you're at. I know what it feels like, the nerves, the excitement, the anticipation of finally getting into turbine helicopters. So in this video, we're going to break down what that actual transition is like. The first thing I noticed, and probably the biggest point to take away from this video, is it's really not that different. If you can fly a small helicopter and you feel comfortable with the control inputs and how that helicopter works, jumping into a bigger turbine helicopter and with the turbine engine, it's not that big of a change and you can definitely do it. The second point is there is a ton of power. I knew turbine engines made a lot of power. I knew they had a lot of power. They could lift really heavy things, but I'll give you the example of how it actually works. When I start my day, I'm solo. So I'm the first one in the helicopter and I go up by myself and then I go do whatever I have to do for the day. And I fly the 407. When you're in that helicopter solo, power to weight ratio is insane. When you lift the helicopter up, it feels so incredibly light and you have so much more margin to the top. When you're in a Robinson R22 solo, yes, you've got a lot of power, but there's not that much margin. When I pick the helicopter up, there is so much power and I just feel so incredibly light. Small collective inputs make big differences just because there's so much power, and that collective has so much ability to move with how much power the engine can make. And to further illustrate the point, the Bell 407 has a max climb rate, so you can climb the helicopter at a maximum of 2,000 feet per minute. Now that is just like a limitation that you have to abide by as the pilot, but the engine in the helicopter can handle way more than 2,000 feet per minute. Even in a smaller turbine engine like a Bell 206, you can start to get some really insane climb rates. Now once you have like a lot of fuel and you've got a full load and you're at max gross weight, yes, it's still not going to climb as fast as like you would if you were solo, but it has so much power, the ability, the performance, it's insane. The third point is the engine responds similarly to a piston engine. Before I got into turbine helicopters, I had heard of this concept called turbine lag. And if you don't know what turbine lag is because the turbine has to spool up, when you require power, it takes some time to spool up and you're not going to have that instant power. Unlike a piston engine, when you increase collective, that fuel and air is going right into the engine and you have nearly instantaneous power. So when you raise the collective, you'll instantly get it in a piston helicopter. So I really believe that this turbine lag concept would be a huge thing because you're not going to have instant power. So you really have to think before the helicopter and you have to slowly increase or you have to pull the collective, and it's going to take a couple seconds for the turbine to spool up. And yes, that's true. In certain turbine engines, the turbine lag is more of a factor. Like in a Bell 206, the turbine lag is a little bit longer. In a 407 or probably an A-Star, the turbine lag really isn't that bad. Yes, you still have to plan your collective moves. So if you're coming in on approach, you want to increase that power, start to get the turbine spooling up, and you don't want to just instantly rip it, but you don't want to do that in a piston engine either. You want to do slow control inputs. And if you need turbine power and you pull the collective and you need that engine to work, it's gonna go. Maybe there's a little bit of a delay, but it's really not a lot. And I thought it would be just a bigger factor. Point number 4 is the engine instrument scan is not a big change. When you're going through flight school, you're taught a scan outside, inside, and how to move your eyes around so that you're totally understanding the environment, what's happening with the helicopter, what's happening outside. And when you get into a turbine helicopter, it's the same thing. You're looking outside, you're looking inside. Now, yes, there are a few more instruments and gauges to look at, but it's really not that different. In a piston helicopter, you've got your engine gauges, oil pressure, fuel, how much power you're making, how hot the engine is. It's basically those same parameters in a turbine helicopter. Now they're displayed a little bit differently, but it's the same thing. And in addition to that, on gauges, they are very clearly labeled so that you can scan them quickly. And most of them have colors. So if it's in the green, you're good. If it's in the yellow, you're probably in a caution or a precautionary area. And if you're red, you're working the engine too hard. So as you're going through this scan, you look at all your instruments and you just make sure your needle or your gauge is within the appropriate area. And yes, you can read the number 2 on the gauge as well, but in a turbine engine, it's not that different than a piston engine. You're looking at the same things, you're constantly moving your eyes around, so there's not necessarily more or it's harder to scan in a turbine engine than a piston engine. You just have to learn how to retrack your eyes versus what you learned in a piston helicopter. Turbine helicopters are very fast. Now, the reason why the speed was such a big change for me is I had some R44 time, which is a faster helicopter, but most of my time was in the Robinson R22 and the Cabri G2, which both have Lycoming 0360 engines. So in those two helicopters, you're flying at usually anywhere from like 60 to 80, maybe 90 knots. I don't remember the exact parameters, but maybe usually around like 70 knots is the average. Now, when I went for my initial interview flight in the Bell 407, I went up with the instructor who was evaluating me, and he's like, all right, you have the controls, and I was able to hover and take off pretty easily. And then we got in the pattern. He's like, all right, let's do like 100, 110 in the pattern. And I was like, 100, 110 in the pattern, like, what? This is so fast. But it's well within the limits of the 407. The 407 can go way faster, and 100, 110 knots in the pattern is like very comfortable for it. But for me, it was like, this is so fast because I was used to doing the pattern in a R22 or Cabri G2 at like 50 to 60 knots. So literally going double the speed in the pattern, things happen way faster. I know maybe 100, 110 knots doesn't seem like super fast if you're like an airplane pilot or you fly really fast aircraft, but that is a big change. Learning a turbine engine is not that hard. Now, I'll tell you the truth, I was extremely scared about this aspect of it. I felt very comfortable teaching, understanding, knowing piston engines. It made sense to me because I had spent so much time studying it. When I got to when I was thinking about learning turbine engines, I just didn't know that much about it. Yes, I knew like basic understandings of how a turbine engine worked, but I really didn't know. So I was very scared about learning the turbine engine. I was scared I wasn't going to understand it. I was scared that I wasn't going to be able to pick up the limitations. I was just intimidated by it, to be honest. But once I started learning it and I actually put my head in the books and had to learn the turbine engine, it's a much simpler design and a simpler engine than a piston engine. There's just less parts overall. So how things move through a turbine engine is very simple. It's simpler than a piston engine. And the final thought is it's not as big of a change as I thought it would be. That's kind of been the theme throughout this whole video, is I just expected this wildly different experience, and it is, don't get me wrong. They're bigger, they're louder, they're longer, they've got more power, they can do more stuff, but turbine engines and turbine-powered helicopters are not that big of a change. If you can fly a small helicopter like an R22, an R44, a Cabri G2, a Schweitzer 300, an Enstrom, you can definitely jump into a turbine-powered helicopter. With a couple hours, you're going to feel relatively comfortable and it's going to feel relatively familiar. You know, I truly do compare it to driving like a Toyota Camry and then jumping into a Ferrari. Yes, a Ferrari, it has more power, it's sleeker, it goes faster, the handling is a little bit different, you can do different stuff with it. If you can drive a Camry, you can drive a Ferrari. They're similar, you know. There's obviously going to be different changes, but once you start, if you drove the Ferrari for 5 hours, you're going to start to feel pretty comfortable. And if you start driving the Ferrari every day, it's going to feel pretty comfortable. You could jump back into the Camry, no problem. So I thought it would be a big change. It's really not. And if you're thinking about doing it, you can definitely do it. And if you found yourself enjoying this video, smash the like button for all kinds of helicopter content, and I will see you on the next one. Take care.